first gonna do this. Yeah.
Yeah, just to recap a little bit, you know, we had been talking about new political culture, and we had talked about the emergence of the third sector, and we were talking about what is this new relationship that's happening right now between digital technology and collective action and social movement mobilization. So I wanted to put our conversation in conversation with this PBS interview with somebody who researches. Sorry, that's your email.
It's already here.
Yeah, I was about to click on it, but I clicked on
we
it.
have it.
The day after the inauguration of President Donald Trump, an estimated 3.5 million people in cities around the country and the world took part in the Women's March, protesting the Trump agenda in what may have been the largest collective protest in American history. The march started with a single Facebook post and grew from there. In Raleigh, North Carolina, Professor Zeynep Tufekci was one of those faces in the crowd.
Marches are great, they're empowering to people, but the magic isn't really in the streets by itself or any online action. It's when you look at the protest and you're, say, a legislator, right? You're thinking, if they can march with 1 million people, what else can they do?
Tufekci teaches in the School of Information at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is the author of the new book, Twitter and Tear Gas, The Power and Fragility of Networked Protest.
The twist in the 21st century seems to be, since we can do things much easier with digital technology, they don't necessarily have the same level of teeth. A similar action, say a March on Washington might have 30, 40, 50 years ago, because that was the result of a long process of organizing.
The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963 took 6 months to organize, arranging buses, bagged lunches, singers and speakers for 250,000 who attended. Tufekci says the march was a show of strength for the civil rights movement built over the previous 10 years.
It pushed the people in power to take the threat pretty seriously.
1 year later, Congress passed and President Lyndon Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. More recently, Tufekci cites the success of the conservative Tea Party movement. It began in the spring of 2009 with a viral video.
This is America! How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage?
Followed by tax day protests around the country. By the November 2010 midterm elections, the movement had a measurable impact.
They got 50+ Congress people. They essentially blocked President Obama's second-term agenda, and arguably they elected a president that they like. So it just shows what the protest leads to depends on what happens next.
In 2011, on the other side of the political spectrum, one email inspired by the Arab Spring protests started Occupy Wall Street. Within weeks, it was a movement with encampments all over the country. But when the camps came down, Occupy had little to show for its agenda.
On the one hand, it was really powerful in bringing to people's attention something that was important, inequality. But if you look at the electoral results, or if you look at sort of the policy, it wasn't taken as a threat. And the people in power just didn't really change their way. Inequality hasn't gone down. We don't have new legislation that opposes or tries to dampen inequality. So you can sort of see that the digital technology empowered both of them, but they start taking different turns right after, with really different consequences.
The ease of organizing and mobilizing online has led to a common critique.
For a while, it was just considered slacktivism. Oh, so what? They pressed a button. Is it too easy just to click a link and signal that I like this and I don't like this? I mean, how does it translate into action?
I think it's a great first step. So that's why I don't like the term slacktivism. I don't think it's slacking in anything to click. It could be a very powerful first step. Even if it stops there, it's got power. The question is, how do you take that very widespread but relatively shallow level of engagement and give people clearly wanting to do something else, right? Well, how do you organize it so more people can step and say, here are things you could do collectively, and by doing it collectively along the way, you also build those important skills of decision making together and hanging together.
While activists adopted digital technology tools, governments tried and failed to disrupt them. For instance, Tefekci points to the 2011 protests in Cairo's Tahrir Square.
The government just didn't know what to do, so they just shut off the internet, which completely backfired. It was the absolute wrong thing to do if you were a government, because it just brings attention. And a lot of parents who were getting news from their kids in Tahrir Square, the cell phones were also cut.
But governments have also learned how to use digital technology. 5 years later, during an attempted coup in Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan relied on digital technology, his iPhone FaceTime app, to rally supporters against rebellious soldiers.
It was really sort of amazing to watch this. They just this little screen, but it confirmed to the country that he was alive. They realized very quickly that the internet and the digital technology would be on their side to counter this coup.
You point out how crucial Twitter and Facebook were in getting people to come out to the street. But you also point out that there's a tremendous amount of power on these platforms now, and that the way that the algorithms are designed
Yes.
could actually determine the success or failure of a movement.
Absolutely. For example, Facebook uses an algorithm, a computer program, to choose how to rank what it shows you. So if you don't see something from someone, maybe Facebook's not showing it to you. For a social movement, that's incredibly consequential.
It was consequential in the summer of 2014 as protests erupted on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, following the fatal shooting of an unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown, by a white police officer. Early on, Tefekci says, the protest got a lot of attention on Twitter, but less so on Facebook because of another viral sensation, the Ice Bucket Challenge.
And I accept the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge for being my...
Facebook kept showing me the Ice Bucket Challenge, even if it was from weeks ago, it just kept showing the same thing. And you know when you go on and there's baby picture, it just shows you things that are cute and cuddly and that get the likes, because that's how it operates. For a social movement, trying to break into the public sphere, that could mean a form of algorithmic censorship, because the algorithm likes certain things and doesn't like certain things.
Tefekci says the motivations of social media companies and social movements are not necessarily aligned.
In the end, it's a platform that is based on delivering you ads, and they want to sort of keep you on there with things that will keep you on there. And all of their business models aren't necessarily in the interests of what the movements are trying to do long term.
How does the Women's March or Black Lives Matter, how do they sustain themselves and turn themselves into powerful actors that can be a threat to whomever it is that they want to force change through?
Right, the lesson I take from all my research into this isn't stop using digital technologies. It's recognize what they're good for and use them fully for what they're good for, but really recognize what they're not good for. And you could use a hashtag to get millions of people to the street, but you can't use a hashtag to figure out how does a group of 100 people in one zip code figure out who's going to run for the school board and who's going to run for Congress and how are we going to organize this. So it's going to come to a hybrid model where we use tech for what it's good for, but not be blinded by the power it gives us in some areas and ignore that it's actually weakening us in other areas by helping us scale up almost too fast. You know, you're going from 0 to 100 miles in just a month or two. You need a better steering wheel than a Facebook group.
Okay, so how did this add to your understanding of what we discussed and where we left the discussion off last class about the extent to which it's useful to distinguish between the online and the offline, and how we connect our readings and the concepts in the readings to these current social movements and what's happening and how they're using social media? What did you all get from the video?
Yeah. think like when we're speaking about like mobilizing, it's really important to think about the fact that like they mentioned how we like now can mobilize so quickly that you don't have time to actually organize. And it's something that people don't necessarily consider because they like, oh, it's so great, like this is so widespread, but in reality, like, you know, you're not actually like getting people to have like necessarily a cohesive understanding of like what the movement is really, like what the underlying goals are, things of that sort. So
yeah, that's such a great point, because that's part of what makes, you know, any projects that you all want to do that are looking at current social movements, it's part of what makes this research so relevant today. It's precisely because so many of those who are involved in the movements aren't taking the time to really analyze them. And you have these headlines about slacktivism, right? I think a big takeaway from this video and from our readings is that it's not just, the question shouldn't be, is it slacktivism or isn't it? It's a much more nuanced and complicated understanding that's needed. Where you look at questions like, how do you take a shallow engagement, as she said, up to the next level? What are the mechanisms? And that's where having an understanding of like framing processes and how you mobilize political elites can be a determining factor in helping you understand why something did or did not have any policy results. So that's where Occupy Wall Street was such a great example, right? So maybe in terms of cognitive liberation, maybe they get gold stars in that department, but in terms of any policy outcomes, almost none, right? And that's where, like, these concepts that we're using in class, this could be a great essay question on your final exam, is asking you to really talk through these concepts and how they can help us understand something like what happened with Occupy Wall Street, right? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'm surprised they didn't talk about it, but I think during the 2016 election, a lot of people mentioned with social media how there was the issue of just constant cycling with regard to Donald Trump, and how like Hillary's narrative just stuck with her for like over a year, whereas Trump's many scandals would just come and go, and people wouldn't really, I guess, stay connected to the scandals because they would just cycle way too quickly.
Can you say more about that?
Yes,
what
like
you think the difference
I think
is?
well, I think that the difference is that if you just hear like Crooked Hillary and Uranium One for over a year, like that sticks with you when you think of the candidate. And you think of Trump, like you won't think of certain scandals just because you forgot about them.
You don't? I do. I mean, I think of the whole bus incident, but what do you all think? Do you think that's an interesting idea? Do you feel like with those two candidates in the past election that was a phenomena that may be tied in some way to social media and to digital technology and to the media in general, that there were terms that really stuck with the portrayal and the narratives? Because again, remember, going back to our readings from the McCarthy, McAdam, and Zoll, it's about competing framings for control of the media, right? So it sounds to me like you're saying, like you're building an argument for ways in which Trump successfully controlled the narratives around him, or maybe there were no attempts to control it and so things just sort of filtered through and disappeared. What do you all think about this? Yeah.
I think the point that in terms of contested frames, Trump is basically like a walking meme. Like lock her up and whatever Crooked Hillary. Like he built a wall. He has these like chants that make for great hashtags and that trend like crazy on Twitter. Versus like Hillary's repeated mantra during debates of like, do you want this man with his finger on nuclear button? No. But is that a great hashtag? No. And so I don't think that I don't know if it falls into the context of frame contestation, because who else was like contesting Trump, like within the Trump movement? No one else was offering like a contested frame for what was going on. But Hillary had like her team didn't have the same level of pizzazz with their.
Yeah, and it was also simplicity of framing, right?
Yeah.
And that was so key in his primaries too, forgetting even the general election. It's how he just tore his way through primary candidate after primary candidate. It was essentially by emasculating various male candidates through like little catchphrases, as you said, that just stuck. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add further to that, I think that the role, like one of those parameters of, the framing is the relationship with the media, right? So I think that the Trump campaign, or that, you know, the entire GOP as well, really tuned in and captured the fact that the media, as it stood in that point in time, was very much attracted to snippy sound bites. There was almost a sense of sensationalism, especially compared to the way international mediums covered the American election. There is that sense of, you know, he said this crazy thing, we have to put this out immediately. And at the cost of that was that many of the things that he would say weren't necessarily factually accurate. So the onus of the media in terms of verifying wasn't really there. Rather, there was more of an emphasis on this crazy thing happened. It's in just, you know, 10, 15 seconds. We're going to put that out there because there's a 24-hour news cycle. We're motivated to create content, but you're not paying attention necessarily to the quality or your social role in terms of, you know, checking that. So in that sense, especially compared to Hillary, who would tend to speak in rather, you know, longer, factually based arguments where she would outline policy. Truth be told, policy isn't particularly exciting or attractive for most of the people, and it isn't therefore for the media. You know, it is a business.
Mm-hmm.
So that relationship I find quite interesting, and then compounding that with the lack of verification of facts that can happen in what is spread through social media. So, you know, oftentimes people would encounter websites that they perceive to be factually accurate, or they would think that this is, you know, a veritable source, and then, you know, that's how the real quote unquote fake news would actually spread, and that definitely also played a role. So
yeah, you're pointing to a whole title shift that we haven't even talked about in media, right? In journalism. Journalism as an industry has fundamentally shifted. And there's a whole other great body of research talking about what's happened with the legitimacy of journalism in this day and age, where lines are blurred between legitimate journalists and me putting up my snap of what's happening live, right? And I think it's so great that you brought that up, because that has to be taken into account, especially because control of framing in the media is such a fundamental component now for social movement mobilization. Yeah, that's great. Any other? Yeah.
I also think that with the media, they were so scared of taking a partisan stance, especially in this election cycle, that it refrained a lot of the articles from actually analyzing what really happened.
Can you say more about that?
I'm trying to think of a specific example, but I do know that with all of these like alternative news sources, the big media names were worried they were losing their readerships, I guess, because of these alternative news sources. And like it's one thing to not take a partisan stance, but it's another thing to not write about the weight of Trump's statements, I guess.
So you're talking about the level of and depth and quality of analysis that's happening in what's being put out there.
Like a normative statement cannot be part. Like there are cases where making a normative statement is not a partisan statement.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I kind of disagree. I feel like the mainstream news outlets definitely polarized. I think like even like the traditional Republicans in the New York Times, like David Brooks, or like MSNBC, like Morning Joe, like they found themselves sort of disassociating from the Republican Party in this past election. But I think what happened here was that Trump basically ran away with he basically took all this bad press coming out of it and sort of like embraced it as part of his frame. He sort of like flipped the frame. So it was like, I don't say it was a positive, but like it helped him, which no one really intended it to do. And then the whole crooked Hillary stuck, like even like in the election when she did like the trumped up trickle down, like a lot of people were like, this is an example. This is her not able to like be relatable. And I don't know what happened, but somehow Trump's team was able to frame it.
Yeah, this is something that actually some of Professor Clark's students from last year have been researching and writing about, is like what happened in the last election and how did he win the election, and how it's much more complicated than it's been portrayed. I don't know if Professor Clark might want to speak to that a little before we transition to you.
Want to speak a little, Professor? I don't know.
Is
Hello?
he still on?
Yeah, I think he's still on.
You asking me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm still on.
Okay, we were wondering if you wanted to say anything, especially about just about what we've been saying about the third sector and new digital technology, and also your students from last year who have been researching what happened in the Trump election. It's something we've been debating here. You know, what were the fundamental differences between the two campaigns and how they mobilize the media and mobilize different voter segments and different scenes to win the election.
Those are the big questions we're dealing with. Okay, sure. I'll make a couple of comments. For background, let me deal with the narrower specifics, then maybe we'll come back to the broader general point later on. I mean, one thing which you're seeing in these two sections on both ethnicity and the new social movements is how can we give you some specific tools, some concepts, some ways of interpreting what's going on as we have new developments. And so we saw this in the Dahl reading, which was splendidly presented by two of you last time, that not only did we have traditional ethnic groups, Italians, Irish, and so forth, but you had a careful interpretation, which Dahl did very splendidly, showing how those things linked with competition among the political leaders, basically the complete exiting from political leadership of the old traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite, which was the entire political leadership in the through most of the middle up to near the end of the 19th century, and then it was completely replaced by the different new ethnic groups. What Dahl thus shows is the interpenetration of 4, 5, 6 concepts: slack, resources, mobilization of new resources through pyramiding. These are the 4, 5, 6 key concepts which you heard briefly discussed and which are important still as general background. I would also put this in terms of framing and underline how much these were stressing it, as Dahl did, in the sense the legitimacy of the more traditional political system to incorporate the new patterns. By contrast, when we got to some of the protests in California, there was an explicit breaking of the rules, and that's when we begin to get to new challenges of what are the rules of the game and how can we begin to interpret this. In a sense, it's a break with Dahl's model of the more incorporation of new constituents. So that's one linkage to the past. If we begin to look for, that is what I'm trying to do is, I think you've heard, and what Lena has been doing very, very well, every 5-10 minutes. If we have something new and relevant, it's great to talk about. We also try to say, what's it mean? How do we make sense of this? Whether you're, this is not an academic question. If you're an activist, if you're trying to elect a new leader, what do you do? And the one way that this linked directly with Chicago local issues was with the challenging election of Harold Washington in 1983. There was a split between the two Irish Catholic candidates, Daley II and Jane Byrne, and that both of them were running in the Democratic primary against each other. Given that, Harold Washington said, maybe I can get 33 1/3 in one vote, even if I could not have gotten 50% alone. And that's exactly what happened. So he beat them and became the mayor by mobilizing mostly African Americans, but also white liberals and certain others who really had never been engaged before, and that informed that in turn transformed the rules of the game of Chicago, which is the most heavily studied, the most intensively studied city in the world. There are hundreds of books about Chicago, especially its politics, its leadership, many by journalists, many by others, and so forth. But the rules were broken, and everybody said, in most of those books, dozens and dozens of books, such as Boss, would say, what the boss says is what happens. It's an elite-dominated system, and nobody at the bottom can get anything they want. They're all crushed by the boss. And yet, Harold Washington beat the boss, all the bosses. And so the question of how that ever happened was what I called up his campaign manager, who was Bill Grimshaw, who with his wife Jackie were the campaign managers of Harold. And I said, Bill, this is phenomenally important for not just Chicago, but the world. You've really got to try to put some notes together, somehow record this of what's happening. He said, no, Terry, I'm too busy. Let's talk another time. So I called him back a month later and I said, Bill, think again. This is critical. What can we do? And he said, okay, I've got an answer. I'll do it on one condition. I said, what's that? That we do it together. So I had no plan at all to join this with him, but I said, okay, let's go. And so basically trying to make sense of that in turn led to part of the ideas of the new political culture linked specifically to the old traditional ethnic battles in Chicago. And in turn, especially to the wild stuff that went on in the Harold Washington primary. That is, people would march on King Drive, stop the traffic, and then the stoplights march out and say, "Come alive, October 5." There was singing, there was dancing, there was music, there were blues, there was jazz, there were radio comedy shows, there were DJs performing and talking about these issues. The African American electoral turnout went from something like 25% to something like 85%. And that is the mobilization of African Americans in the primary election transformed the whole rules of Chicago and elected Harold Washington. So the point which you've heard made, I would say, is not just is it the media, is it the new technology versus the non-technology. We want to look at both for sure and see where and how and what specific degree do we have concepts, mechanisms, dynamics which join and activate the one and the other. And for sure, the new media, Facebook, the iPhones, the devices clearly are critical, but they're not alone. That is the fact that they're as powerful as they are means that we simply do not have enough coherent tools, whether we're mayors or whether we're the Facebook company, which is now hiring PhDs to try to make more sense of this stuff. These are very new. But what I'm trying to point out again with the doll example is that we have some earlier concepts, or we have some new phenomena, and those in turn are generating new concepts. So let's just tick off a few more examples of tools that you can take away that will help to make some coherence out of this. The whole idea, which is one of our 3 dimensions of scenes, of authenticity, I resisted substantially. It seemed to be too vague, too loose, too messy. But then there was a brilliant PhD here in Chicago on a jazz musician who happened to have a white face. And he tried to play in the downtown jazz clubs, and the organizers of the club said, "Oh, no, you can't play here. You're not authentic. You're not an authentic jazz musician for sure." So he couldn't get any jobs there, but he did in the African American neighborhoods where people judged the music, not the color of the face as much. So in that sense, it was the opposite expectation of how racism would work, and it was authenticity over the quality of the music rather than the color of the face in ways that stress the idea of authenticity as a conceptual, sociological, that is sociological, social scientific, but more than that, it's something which we need to add to legitimacy along. So whereas the Max Weber doll tradition stresses legitimacy, authenticity becomes critical, as does then theatricality. That is, people are in the streets, people are making noise, people are making things happen, and how do they become successful theatrically? Okay, let me mention then a new critical concept which we developed called buzz. And buzz, like scene, has a long meaning before we picked it up. But what we've tried to do in sections of the Scenes book, as well as in a paper Dan Silver and I did in the Canadian Journal of Sociology on buzz, and then in sections of the Kentuckville Karaoke, is to begin to codify buzz using some of the same concepts that Dahl did in Who Governs. That is, it's a resource. Buzz is a resource which can be bought, sold, converted, exchanged into other resources if you have more money, if you have more votes, if you have more access to the media, and so forth. But the one distinctive thing, which I've stressed in a whole new course last spring, is that artists and the arts tend to have a distinctive power in their ability to articulate, to bring emotion, to bring color, to bring engagement and passions linked with artistic expression, which artists intuitively do more as part of their job, and where social scientists are distinctively bad in general in playing down emotion. The economists most of all. But the point of buzz is that and then I say economists in general, but again, the huge exception in Chicago, and Gary Becker particularly, did a paper on buzz, and he said one way to capture the buzz in a city in the economy is to look at people standing outside, and the number of people standing outside in line trying to get into a new restaurant. That's exactly the kind of idea that is, one both has a concept of buzz, and then one has measures, dimensions, and elements of how is it working, how does it get translated into something else. And so the economists don't just think about, markets and money, but also what are the broader consequences that people don't tend to think about. So if you steal, you buy something, how does that change the price for everybody else, potentially all around the world? That kind of aspect of bringing buzz in is what is critical, where the social media can make a difference. Okay, then. 2 words, as Lena pointed out. How's this come together for Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the like? We have 7 or 8 students, mostly undergraduate political science majors, going to law school, or now some of them are left, some are still here, and we've been working for about a year and a half. And the simple big idea, very simple to state, is that there is no Trump foundation, there is no Trump scene, but there are many Trump scenes, plural. And rather than looking for one of them, and this is a general point, rather than looking, say, what's the social class, or what's the economic group, what's the ethnic group that elected Trump, there is no single economic, ethnic, religious, or other group. There are many different Trump scenes. And the amazing success of Trump was putting them together, and the reason that others did not as well was because others were more constrained by their political party programs, their political party structures, specifically the ideological or the sense of this is how you have to do things. And Hillary was halfway breaking away from that, as did her husband Bill. He went further than she did. She moved back, in a sense, closer to the more traditional democratic structures, and that probably hurt her more than Trump, who went far in the other direction. And so if you think of the new political culture, the dimension of issue specificity is what Trump really picked up on. But he, in that sense, what I'm pointing out is you can use some of the ideas of the new political culture to interpret Trump, even if he's ideologically not at all like Tony Blair or Bill Clinton. He shares with them, however, the populism and the appeal to average citizens. That's the key big driver, which most people haven't stressed enough. we're witnessing in the last 20, 30 years a huge increase in the legitimacy of individual citizens. And then how and why does this transform everything else? That's a big question. And so the social media, cell phones, etc., clearly are part of this, but then what are the specific sub-mechanisms, the types, the activities? And so looking at types of Trump scenes, which we do in the paper, and the paper's on, it's online, it's available, we present versions of it several times in classes. And it's wonderful to hear these 6 or 7 students all standing up. Each one says a sentence and another one interrupts and adds the end of the sentence. And so the whole paper was written that way. It keeps getting better day by day, week by week, as more ideas keep coming in. So there are ideas, for instance, of religiosity can combine with unemployment, can combine with fiscal liberalism in one region and in one kind of scene, but in another, if you have secular rather than religious activity and combined with full jobs but some kind of status reversal, that can go in a very different direction. So that is, there are many sub-dynamics, many subgroup scene-like phenomena that we can identify if we think in terms of scenes rather than one bigger, more coherent, simpler concept like class or rich, poor, gender, age, race. So as I put it, I think you've heard me say race, class, gender, national origin all together explain about 15%. And if you're trying to go beyond that, or if you want to get elected and you want to do something different, then don't just look for voters in terms of those 4 traditions. And so Trump did that, Bill Clinton did that, Tony Blair did that, and Trump just went further. But if we look around the world, in Cairo, in Rio de Janeiro, in Hong Kong, this is happening again and again and again, and the consequences are far larger in the sense that in Cairo, the president resigned after about a week of fairly quiet, peaceful protest. In Kiev, the president resigned after a couple of weeks. Those were not fully peaceful. I mean, there were some burnings and so forth, but it was a small number of people in the streets in the capital. It was not a referendum. It was not an active vote and so forth. So that is, these demonstrations, these scene-like activities with strong political overlaps, with the legitimate, let's say, I shouldn't say legitimate, because all these are sometimes borderline legitimate, but the rules of the game of the more established political system are things which are continually operating. We're getting, and so my quick point is, looking at, noticing, recognizing that these are clearly new phenomena, but second, how can we mobilize the more traditional concepts? How can we sharpen and make them better and stronger, such as framing. So framing is a loose, long concept that goes back for decades, but how does it work specifically in these new kinds of contexts? This is what you hear us discussing, I think, very effectively in the last 3 sessions, with new concepts like cosmopolitanism, new, I deliberately say, going back to the ancient Greeks, to Marcus Aurelius, and so forth. But new in the sense that they haven't been used very much in Chicago. In most of social science, the way Christina is now doing her thesis, Lena's joining of these with the women's movement, with new modes of mobilization, and then asking, as was in our video earlier today, asked. I think those are good pointed questions. We don't have clear answers, but and so I guess what I'm also pointing out is we have some things which are loose in the beginnings, others are much more established and traditional, and we want to give you a set of each of these that you can both see, you can extend, and in your own work you can help to sharpen and help all of us make these better as we go ahead. Whether you're using them in the street, whether you're using them in life, and or writing and thinking about them in the future, you're all part of this. So the style of our class, as you're hearing it now, is an encapsulated version of what I'm saying in more abstract intellectual terms. Okay, let me stop there for a bit for any reactions to that.
Yeah, can we get any questions from students? We have one question for you. Can you come up? Say it close to here.
Hi, Professor. It's Daniel, by the way. Sure. I'm just curious, like with Harold Washington. So after Harold Washington died, how come when DLA 2 came to power, like why did the machine just start up again after he left?
Well, the simple answer is that is the structure of Harold Washington's own political base. And was very explicitly stated by the two Grimshaws as campaign managers, they managed a coalition of dozens and dozens of different competing, warring, battling subgroups, both in the campaign and then second, more generally, in the Chicago City Council. So there were roughly 23 city council members out of 50 who backed Harold Washington, but Harold Washington always had he never had a majority of the council. He only had, that is the political machine, so-called, led by the two Eddies, Fast Eddie Verdoliak, who you bike by in your UC-BC tours by the southwards, and Eddie Burke. They were the two key leaders of the Democratic Party organization, which still controlled the votes in the city council. So Harold Washington couldn't do anything except what he was permitted to do administratively. He didn't have the votes to pass his own budget, so-called his. It wasn't his, it's the council's budget, and so forth. So in that sense, after he died, no one could hold together the many different competing groups, including especially the African Americans. So the African Americans divided most simply into machine and reform. So half of them were roughly reformers, and the other half went back to the machine in different ways. That's the quick answer.
We have another question.
Yeah, sure.
Just
Okay.
speak.
Hi, it's Justine. So just a quick question. I'm a little bit confused about how Trump was able to appeal to like so many different kinds of scenes, like you're saying, because I understand that he kind of embraced this new political culture, whereas maybe Hillary didn't as much. Except I still don't understand why he was able to like appeal to so many different types of people.
Well, that's what all the media are still talking about right now, many are denying that it's happening. There's all kind of debate going on. But I guess what I would add, which helps to give us more insight, because this is so emotional, especially for Americans and academics, is to try to have longer, either a little bit of history and or other comparative examples such as Macron in France, or some of the other changes in Turkey, for instance, and as well as elements in Seoul, because the mayors and the presidents of Korea are going through some turbulent changes in terms of some overlapping kinds of issues. So that the simple point I'm making is there's no one model that explains all of these. We have pieces. We have concepts like, and I'd be careful and not to say that Trump is a part of the new political culture. Rather, what I'm stressing is Trump is an illustration of strong issue specificity, which is only one of the 7 basic dimensions of the new political culture. So in that sense, I mean, he's the opposite of the new political culture's stress on social liberalism. He's classically conservative, in that is he looks like a traditional conservative on both fiscal and social issues. He should be part of the traditional right in that sense. But he's the opposite in the sense that he appeals to the individual citizen using completely non-traditional means of avoiding the party, avoiding the primary, avoiding the Democratic and Republican Party rules of seniority and the like, and doing wild things like Twitter, and then of course breaking rules of the game about language and proper language, and etc. So in that sense, remember one more simple concept from Dahl, Slack, S-L-A-C-K, which we haven't talked about too much in this class, but it's a critical piece here. Less than half of Americans vote in presidential elections, and maybe a quarter vote in local elections, 25%. So a huge issue is simply turnout. If you can get people to get out of their chairs, leave their TV sets, and come out and vote, that's much easier than it is to change anybody's view. And so very few people have changed their basic views, but turnout and differential turnout is the major explanation of how fundamental political changes occur. There's a PhD here even on the 1933 election in the United States, that the whole New Deal was not based on many people changing their views. It was mostly based on differential turnout of new voters who came to the polls for the first time. So Slack is a big concept, and the Slack in the simplest term is having people turn out and vote who didn't vote before. And so there's been a lot of national media, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, has many coverage of, say, rural North Carolina, rural West Virginia towns. And certainly those can be important, and they can be critical in a primary if you're dealing with a state which is very close to 50-50. In more general terms, it's a mistake to focus so strongly on, say, the West Virginia town, and to ignore the fact that for instance, within New York City, of the 5 boroughs, one of the boroughs voted in majority for Trump. Staten Island, in New York State, voted for Trump, etc. So there were massive numbers. That is, I think there were 54% of white women. At least the exit poll suggested 54% of all white women voted for Trump. So in that sense, the march of women against Trump clearly is important, but that is, you've got a conflict between the women who voted and the women who marched. And so gender does not explain voting for Trump. Let me stop there for a second.
Do you have a question? We have another question coming up, and in the meantime, Professor Clark, I think your mic got muffled just a little bit like a minute ago.
Okay, now I moved it. I think I moved it closer and further from my mouth.
Yeah, it's perfect now. It's perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Here's the next question.
Like you're here.
You asked the question whether it's a technology versus no technology, and you said there could be some mechanisms and dynamics that combine both. Would you elaborate more on this?
Let me think. There are lots of people who are now. One example was a master's thesis last year, was very nicely done, of looking at the massive followings of people who are very popular in social media. And one theme was to explore the degree to which the leaders can successfully mobilize many followers, even replacing parents and family, generally in Western families, but also potentially in Asian. That is, if you've got, and so it went into examples, for instance, of taking a star or multiple stars and pointing out that you have many younger, let's say, people around 20 years old who may break with their parents and who are looking for alternatives. And so the normal alternative in the past was the so-called peer group, your friends in high school or your friends in college. As you have the social media playing a potentially more active role, the question is, how does the technology join with the non-technical? I would say a critical instance is the creation of, on the social media, the creation of subgroups that get built up around many different patterns. And so looking at how those work is an interaction between the potential of the technology, not so much the hardware, but the algorithm is too simple. That is, algorithms and people using them can easily manipulate these, or they'll go to they can go to a new medium if they don't like the way that Facebook works. They're new subgroups and new social media all the time, new apps and so forth. For Instagram, Twitter, that replaced the ones that were there just 4, 5, 7 years ago. But to follow through just a little bit with one or two examples, the idea, for instance, of what should I as a 20-year-old do in what is right in terms of my relationship with my boyfriend? Should we do this or do that or not? So I can ask my mother, but maybe I don't want to ask her, maybe I'll ask it in a different way. I can also post it as a question on Facebook, for instance, and then the important point is some of the leaders in the social media will actively respond to questions like this on a very personal level, saying, Susan, you asked the question and it's an important one for one to think about, and here's what I would do in that situation. So you have social media leaders personally advising one person on how to act in a non-social media situation in ways that can interpenetrate between the social media and daily life decisions. And these can be either, should we march in the streets now, or should I go to that bar on Friday night, or should I be with people who are of this ethnic or religious group in their neighborhood? Is it safe to go there? I mean, these kinds of questions borderline the social media and the day-to-day actions. I'll just mention one more quick example. Another BA thesis was by a woman who wanted to study the underground music clubs in Chicago, and these are officially not supervised by the city government. They don't pay taxes. The tickets don't get. There may be no tickets, or there may be a voluntary contribution to get in, something like that. But there are over 100 of these, which are listed in various ways. And she found them on the web. Question is, which neighborhoods are they in? Why? What are their locations? And what explains where and why they're successful? And so she very neatly got not the names of them all. They're in locations with ArcGIS and so forth. And she then measured the distance from each of these clubs to the nearest L stop, the nearest bus stop, the nearest freeway, and so forth, and found that access through public transportation, like the L stops, was critical, but then also having them in inexpensive areas, such as Little Village, Mexican-American West Side neighborhood, was particularly popular, even though most of the people who went there had nothing to do with Mexican background, and they were from all over the rest of the city. So in that sense, these are ways of using social media to, and seeing how the rules, how a number of possible dynamics, distance, cost of public transit, distance to the nearest L stop, which are classic concepts and ways of explaining these things from geography and urban economics, would interact with something like a bohemian style of having an appeal to the non-traditional through the bohemian snubbing the nose of the bourgeois. In that sense, combined to generate an underground concept. We have a video which we made on Paris called the Paris Underground, which is one of the scenes in Paris, which we, and the video's in English, it's about half an hour, and it's a lot of fun if you want to see the ways that this works out in the Paris subways, in ways that they have people illegally playing music, selling their paintings, writing music, and then doing lots more politically to organize in ways that create an underground that in turn can burst into political and other implications. Okay.
All right. Is there a last question in the final 4 minutes?
Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah, I have a couple more general comments if we don't, but
sure.
But
Yeah. No more questions. We've got about 4 minutes left here.
Okay. Thanks for the timing. But let me make one point explicit, which you've seen in the last 3 or 4 sessions where I have been less active. One is that you as students have got a lot of good things to say. There's a lot of talent in the room. Speak more, write more, talk up a little bit more. Second, we've got 3 very talented, very different teaching assistants. I should even say 4 if we include Joseph Hughes, the former teaching assistant. He and I taught this course maybe for 4 or 5 years together, and we developed the initial syllabus. And you can see each of these 4 people have very different views, which they partially articulated explicitly. But if you look at the topics of cosmopolitanism, of the human trafficking, and look at the way that you have a very interesting mixture of normative as well as positive concerns joining together and making stronger social science out of all of this. But second, you're here for advanced research. You're also here for general education. Most of you are in the college or your first-year grad students. General education is part of this. The traditional general education used to include, say, the grand tour, where the older elite would tour around the world and learn going place to place. More narrowly, anthropologists would traditionally train themselves and their new anthropologists by going to the field for at least 1 full year and learning how to do it yourself. You can do this now either by being in class or simply watching on YouTube, but if you make yourself conscious that this is a lesson I want to try to learn from, global, local politics is learning how people do things differently, and you can become, as Marcus Aurelius and Christina said, more cosmopolitan by being more conscious of the differences, such as one of you nicely asked the question, who do the North Koreans hate more than the Americans? And the answer was, the Japanese. All right. So the point is, we're not the center of the world. Japan is a much more important traditional center of Asia, but clearly, in terms of numbers, China is obviously a big player. But where and how these bring transformations in our worldviews is part of what we're trying to articulate through concepts like scenes and more, and the models from, say, the Tocquevillian model in the Tocqueville book, the Jane Jacobs participation model, with Bohemia as a second, and then where each of these fall flat and where the arts can bring in new power through scenes, through buzz, and through mobilization of slack into new pyramiding of resources that have more dollar value, more votes, more impact, and if combined with, they don't need to be in conflict with, they can combine with money, they can combine with violence, they can combine with traditional religion, as you saw with Joseph Yee's discussion of evangelicals. All of these can combine in powerful ways, and we're all trying to build sharper concepts that can both help us make the policies and use the policies, but also understand the policies at the same time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been great to listen to you.